I'm just going to welcome everyone and thank everyone for joining our second partner convening of this year. We kicked off our first one in January, and this is the format we're going to be doing throughout the year. And I'm going to allow Caroline a little bit of time to explain the format and what we're hoping to do with these partner convenings. So again, thank you all. And I'm going to turn it over to Caroline to give a little context.
Yeah, and some of you might have heard me kind of describe this in January, but some of you are new to our partner convening format this year, and we've kind of switched things up compared to how we've convened groups in the past. In the past, we had a lot of work groups that people were members of, and this year we're really trying to broaden things and invite everyone and anyone who cares about whole person health and health equity into these partner convenings. So I bet that many of you are doing work and on health equity and whole person health, and that your organization's mission probably has something to do with that. So this is really a space to kind of explore these mutual goals that we all have and reflect and connect. We're making a lot of effort to make sure that there's small breakouts during each of these monthly convenings, because as all of us are busy, the one thing we forget to do is slow down and connect and get to know one another. It's the thing that often just gets bumped to the sideline when we're dealing with urgencies and crises. So we're intentionally building in time for people to connect in small groups, and hopefully that has ripple effects outside of this meeting. For those of you who had to register for our meetings, like maybe some of you registered for each of the monthly meetings in a row, which might have been a little bit painful. But if you're wondering why we're implementing registration this year, it's because this truly is open to everyone and anyone, which means that we don't know who wants to be at the table. We can't control a calendar series. We can't control the invite list. It's really up to you to self-select in. And hopefully, if we do a good job with the national speakers and the content, you'll want to keep coming back. And of course, if you think we've missed the mark, or if you think we should highlight something in our region that would really help all of us learn and grow together, let us know. We're open for feedback, and we can kind of bring that into future convenings. So I hope you learn a lot today, and I hope you're inspired by both national speakers and also local ones. And we hope you'll join us for future ones as well. Monty, I think I'm kicking it to you now to just talk a little bit about the agenda and the working agreements.
You bet. Thanks, John and Caroline, for kicking us off, and good morning, everyone. I'm Monte Roulier with Community Initiatives, one of your partners are helping with this bridge year, along with Better Focus and Chris Keller, who you know, and Elizabeth Hardig on our team. So really glad to join you and be helping with some facilitation here today. And so Caroline kind of gave a high level view around kind of what the flow of the day looks like. So in addition to kind of welcoming and kind of reconnecting here, going to offer up a little bit of a framework for thriving together, which is a way of thinking about whole people and whole health and what it takes to really thrive. And that will kind of lead us into a national perspective. Tyler Norris, who I'll introduce more at the Wellbeing Trust, to hear a little bit of that. And, you know, as Caroline had suggested, this idea of really learning from what's going on outside of our community, but recognizing there are a lot of bright spots. There's a lot to build on within this region. So we're going to get a chance to hear from some local leaders around some holistic approaches to mental health and some exciting things that are going on locally. And that will bring us into some small group dialogue. And just again, to double click a little bit of what Wendy said, this is, these partner learning sessions are an opportunity to hopefully be inspired by what is possible, to get smarter together, to have some common ways of thinking about the world differently, and maybe to surface some new possibilities for how we work and learn together. So really glad that all of you are here, however frazzled and cold. This is it's precious time in everybody's schedule. And so just delighted that you're here. And to maximize our time, I'm going to offer up a couple of working agreements for the partner session. So I think the next slide here. Again, thanks for being here. We'll make sure that we honor people's time by ending for sure on time. And as we're in both the chat and small groups, just encourage people to share airtime. Would love to just hear as many voices as possible, and there'll be, ample opportunities in the small group. But hopefully in the chat as well, as you all start to kind of think about your work together. And if there's some things that you're hearing that Tyler or the panelists said, hopefully you can affirm some of those or ask some questions. We like to say, be rigorous on ideas and gentle on people, which we sometimes have, that backwards in our culture today in different ways. And that really relates to dialogue. And I think we have another slide, just, we use the term dialogue. And one of the ways that I think we learn together is through dialogue. And it's slide that we'd used last time, and some folks had asked for copies of this idea that debate is assuming there's one right answer and you have it, right? And dialogue is really assuming that there's lots of people on this call, in fact, all 34, that have different ideas and perspectives that are really important. Debate tends to be more combative and about winning and listening for where there might be weaknesses or flaws. And dialogue is really more about collaborating and figuring out where it is that we might have in common, what we might build on together, and really listening to understand and find meaning. And we like to say, that debate is reinforcing, our same points over and over again. We get kind of stuck, and dialogue is really about balancing advocacy and inquiry, bringing what we know and really bringing our questions as well. So I hope that's the spirit that we will bring to our time together is dialogue. We sometimes say, based on a sign on a church we'd seen many, many years ago, some of us, come as you are, but don't leave as you come. When we're in dialogue, we're learning from each other, and we're transformed by being with each other. So this is a dialogue. Next slide, please. Here. And I'm going to throw this back over to John just to kind of root us in kind of the larger context for how this conversation is going to unfold.
And as we get into the conversations today, right now, what I really encourage you to do is take a moment and read that new mission on the right-hand side of the screen that you can see on the slide. For a lot of individuals who were involved as part of the Medicaid Transformation Project work, you are probably familiar to what we were as an organization focused on this waiver work with the Healthcare Authority. But in 2020, we adopted a new mission statement. And really the goal of this year is to help our region and help us really come to live that mission and shift from one that was really focused in clinical work to one that is really focused in whole person health, well-being, and bringing people together. And so a lot of what we're encouraging in these partner convenings, and a lot of what we're going to be trying to do over the course of this next year that we've called a bridge year, is really bring that mission to life and really feel that we are living that mission moving forward as we bring that value to our region. If you go to the next slide. And in 2021, we also worked to root ourselves in that mission by developing what we called 3 pillars, and you can see them on the screen. And the 3 pillars was really that foundational structure and how NCACH is going to organize and operate to live the mission that you just read on the last slide. So I'm not going to read this out loud, but ultimately our goal as a region is to build a regional portfolio or a regional plan to move our region and well-being that is really informed by, number one, shared decision-making and an inclusive process of distributed leadership, and that is rooted in data. So as you go top to bottom, those are the steps we are taking really so that our region together, not just as NCACH or not as individual partners, can move forward and focus on well-being. And again, one of the things that we've really emphasized over the last few months is that we're doing that in an inclusive process that really involves all of our partners and the residents that we impact as well. And that's going to be some of the focus points throughout the course of this year. And then if you turn to the next slide, Monte, I think you are up.
Great. Thanks, John, and appreciating the chat. Jesus there. Yeah, I think that's a really great way to anchor that this bridge year, this kind of transition from kind of the important Medicaid transformation work that you all have been doing and will continue to bring forward, but to really open up that aperture to whole person, whole health, and think about what it really takes for the thriving and those pillars to get us there. So some of us have talked a little bit. I know earlier on, Chris Keller introduced this idea of thriving together, which is a emerging kind of lens and approach for thinking about whole people and whole health and what it really takes for all people and places to thrive. So I'm going to offer just a little bit of context as one lens by which to kind of hear both the national and local presenters today. And so Elizabeth, why don't you go ahead and click along with me if you don't mind? Thank you. So the brief context is that the Thriving Together framework really has been building on, decades of work that we're learning from community-based work, but kind of has culminated into a new approach. And it was inspired by federal partners at the early stages of the pandemic to really engage national, leading non-governmental organizations and leading community-based groups to really see how they thought what it would take to kind of move from this really tumultuous time, economic downturns, greater awareness of social and racial inequities, to a different place, not just to recover to the status quo. And so that's kind of what sparked this Thriving Together approach. And just as a little bit of a placeholder, this is now informing the federal plan for interagency long-term recovery and resilience. So it's both informing the federal plan, but it has a life of its own in a lot of other settings with investors, and most importantly is designed for place-based communities. Next slide, please. And so one thing that is maybe important to know around the Thriving Together approach is just this idea of thriving as a really measurable, powerful social science indicator. And some of you may have seen that Gallup has been doing this across the globe for a very long time, being able to measure the percent of people through self-report measures that they are thriving, as opposed to those that are experiencing suffering and struggling. And so again, the idea of kind of building off of this, not only this measure, but this idea of thriving, that was how the springboard started. Is how do we move beyond just the current to recover to greater resilience and strength? And this, we don't have to unpack this whole thing, but this just indicates how sensitive thriving is to external shocks. And so clearly, the last couple of years have been a real shock to our communities and individuals within our communities and families. And that's kind of what we started to peg a little bit of this around. Next slide, please. We'd asked a lot of the, our leaders across the country to really think about, and we started with a premise, which is, or a big question, which is, how do we convert loss into renewal? And we started with this premise that, it's really within our communities, either happening now or the potential within our communities to really help move us forward. And how do we organize locally and nationally around a unifying, measurable expectation of all people in all places thriving, no exceptions. Next slide, please. Thank you, Elizabeth. So talked with a couple of CHIs about this recently, and this is national work that is kind of a little bit of the, I'd say, the state of the state around how we are thinking about well-being. Well-being, of course, increasingly being a way that we're thinking about health and well-being a little bit broader idea of our mental, physical, social, spiritual, physical well-being, even though some of us see health in that way. And there's a couple ways of seeing well-being, of that our individual perspectives and experiences that affect how we think, feel, and function. And that's a little bit about the measurement that I had on the other slide, which is evaluating people's best possible life, where they are now and where that would be in the future. And that's Cantrell's ladder. So people tell us a lot about how they're currently experiencing, and it's a very valid way of looking at that. And then really looking at the context of our lives, as many of you study social determinants of health, really understanding those urgent services that we need under adversity to really help us when we temporarily, hopefully, are experiencing challenges to our health and well-being. I think we're going to hear a lot of interesting examples with our local leaders around how they're helping with urgent services during these times of adversity. And then there's the more upstream vital conditions, those things of people and places that we all rely on in order to thrive, to be able to live into our potential. Next slide, yeah, thanks. So I've kind of alluded a couple times to the vital conditions, and we can share more, those of you who haven't seen or heard about this work, but it is a comprehensive way of really seeing those conditions that all people, no matter where they are in the life course, no matter where they are in the globe, need on a regular and reliable basis to thrive. So things like thriving natural environment, really the freedom from hazards from our natural environment. Our friends, and I don't know if it's spilled over into your region, experiencing flooding or certainly a pandemic that might have induced by a natural environment, but also access to clean water and healthy soils and air. There's the vital condition around basic needs for health and safety, and this is one that we're going to kind of drill into a little bit more. Not only do we have access to routine health services, but those really include freedom from addiction and violence and trauma, and really the mental health space that we know is so vital. And food is included in this particular vital condition of humane housing. And these are things that are really straightforward. There's an enormous amount of research behind each one of these, but what does it look like to have consistent humane housing and located in a way that's connected to the services that are so important to all of us? Meaningful work and wealth, not just having enough money through our work, but also really the dignity that comes and purpose that comes with work. And so what does that look like in our communities? And the ability to look at learning the first 1,000 days of life all the way through formal education and informal education and opportunities to learn. So that's a lot of the vital condition around lifelong learning. Reliable transportation, just as you would guess, just access to transportation that connects us to the things that we need. And this last one I'll just double click on is belonging and civic muscle. I think there's so much research, and it's so much probably just intuition and experience that each of you have around how vital belonging is to all of us. We're wired to belong, and being able to kind of co-create our futures together. And that's a little bit of the civic muscle, our agency together. So these together really make up the vital conditions, and they're very much interrelated, that have driven a lot of the thriving together approach. Next slide, please. And again, we're happy to continue to chat out and share more of those if this is new territory, but I'll go right to the center of this graphic. And Chris Keller and Elizabeth on the call had a lot to do with helping national partners start to kind of evolve some of this idea that, our populations are made up of a mix of thriving, suffering, and struggling. And as we come into this moment, as suffering and struggling continue to grow in many parts of our country and regions, there's a greater demand for urgent services, in some ways in very unsustainable ways. And so these vital conditions ideas, how do we make sure that we are investing and ensuring the vital conditions for all people to thrive, as you can see on that far right-hand corner. And the only other thing I'll just mention on this slide is you can see this legacies that is going into the thriving and suffering, struggling, is just acknowledging the legacies of innovation and of community and advances in human rights, as well as legacies of exclusion and harm, and recognizing that we have systems in place that not all people are thriving, and sometimes by accident and sometimes by design. And how do we really recognize those legacies we've inherited and recognize that we have opportunities to create new legacies? And when I look at your very ambitious mission, it seems like the work of this group is really to think about what are the new legacies that we can create, so we don't just have a really nice, rhetorically attractive mission statement, but what does it really look like to create those legacies for whole person, whole community health? Next, please. I won't hit this slide very much, just to know that there's a lot of momentum around thriving together. Not only is this a bridging framework for the federal government, USDA, Health and Human Services, SAMHSA, you name it, over 30 agencies are using this, the metrics as the strategies to really think about new ways of partnering with states. Groups like the Build Healthy Places Network are really looking at this at a neighborhood level. What are the policies that really fit within these vital conditions? And you're going to hear more from my friend Tyler here in a moment. There's a lot of this at the intersection of economic prosperity and community health, the community development world. And on the bottom there, the impact for social impact exchange, some of the leading foundations and social impact investors are really looking at this lens by which they're thinking about future investments and how we innovate. So there's a reason to at least be entertaining how thriving together might be one of the helpful lenses by which you're thinking about the work moving forward. And on that note, I'm not sure if there's another slide, but maybe not, which is fine.
Monte, there's a question in the chat that just asked, do you find that if one is affected, that all vital conditions have a sense of decline?
It's a really good question. Thanks for pulling that out. For sure, these are very much interrelated. And, some of the vital conditions are more connected to some than others. We see that the belonging and civic muscle communities that have greater resilience tend to have a greater sense of belonging. And we are not only measuring that, but really working with groups around how they create belonging and build their strength for how they work together across that. So the one that is really inextricably linked to all the others is belonging and civic muscle. When that declines, we see declines in how well we are able to deliver on all those other vital conditions. But depending on what community you're in, if you have a community that has a really strong, a lot of work around food systems and local food work, that has a strong relationship on meaningful work and dignity, right? So if we have food workers that don't work in good environments, we'll see some real strong declines in that. So keep the questions coming. And I'll just say that Tyler Norris was one of the key folks that the federal government first called to really start to host Thriving Together. So he's the CEO of the Wellbeing Trust. He's over 3+ decades. He's been a well-known social entrepreneur in the healthy, sustainable, equitable, now well-being communities movement, and now is the CEO of the Wellbeing Trust, which is really on the leading edge of a lot of the work around reimagining how we address mental health and well-being, both upstream and downstream. And he actually was the first president and created community initiatives and is a dear, dear friend of mine. So Tyler, I'm wondering if you might share a little bit around how this looks and maybe going a little bit into Thriving Together with a mental health lens and well-being lens. So welcome.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate that kind intro, Monty and Carolyn and John, what you've said. And if you don't mind, before I get into my start, can I build on Penny's question? It's just such a great question. And I think it goes to all this, and I'll do my official start here. We could look at the kids of our communities while we get at this, right? Penny, sometimes we've been thinking about forms of health and forms of wealth, when we think about our societies or our community, and I suspect you're thinking this or you wouldn't have asked the question, right? I live in Idaho. I'm living in rural America. We have farm country. We deplete our environment, that's going to impact income. We already know that if you deplete income, it impacts health and well-being. We know that if you undercut the health and well-being of people, it undercuts education outcomes and income. So I think that just like we think about ourselves as whole people, spirit, mind, body, our relationships, our whole lives as whole people, so are our communities whole. And if you deplete any one form of health or wealth for long enough, it will pull the others down. Just like if we undercut some part of our family or our business or our community, it will eventually become our vulnerability. So I love I think systems like question that's underneath all of that. And John, if I might just say, I love what you were just describing as the evolution. I think it's a both and kind of evolution from your original mission statement to the new one, and not only looking at what we need to be doing in clinical care and the finance for that, but this larger recognition of what does human flourishing look like and how do these social determinants of health, or as Monty so beautifully just framed, these vital conditions for well-being. And again, forgive me, I know you're in country where people show up politically very differently. I have always struggled in talking about the social determinants of health with my more conservative friends. It's always felt social, and what's determined when we know that the world's more dynamic than that. So I am finding a lot more thoughtfulness and also response to thinking, what are those vital conditions for well-being that are part of human flourishing, not some determinant or some social thing. And as trying to be sort of bridging language, given the polarities in our society right now, I think we do much better with that. Okay, so comments. First, I'm really happy to be here with you because leading a national scope philanthropy, at the end of the day, all of it touches the ground in the form of our local democracy and how people of different walks of life come together to prioritize and build community and political will to do things. And so what's great about our country is exactly what you're doing, which is that this is how we roll. This is how we get things done. And I'm not suggesting that we don't need good state policy and federal policy and there's not else that happens, but it's really about how communities come together. And I know you know that because it's why you're here. And my life has been dedicated. I think much more of this as a vocation for these last 30, 40 years than some career, a calling to improve the health of people and places. What does it mean to measurably improve the health of people and places? Or to use your language, to support more whole people in more whole communities, right? That are gardens to grow people in. James Rouse, who did Faneuil Hall in Boston, the great developer, familiar with him, he was a mentor of mine early in his life, my life before he passed. He's always said that a healthy community is a garden to grow people in. That always match. So here's my slide of the kids. I've got a 26 and a 28-year-old, and I'm always thinking about, is what we're doing really benefiting our kids? I think how do we create these gardens for human flourishing as a really big piece. But I also, besides being a parent and a civic person and trying to cross the divides of red, blue America and focus on pragmatism, right? Things that actually work. I am now and have been for the last 5 years, the CEO of a mental health philanthropy that's associated with Providence Health right there in your backyard. Providence, as you know, is a big integrated delivery system. And without going into 1,000 care settings and all that, I just want to say a couple things. One is that we are greatly challenged with the first COVID cases in the state of Washington and this 2-year piece. And I just want to say a little something about workforce, because it does go to what we're working on right now. And I'm sure it's impacting your organizations. And I want to think about workforce in 3 ways. This will then be where I land. Monty, can you give me coaching on when I need to end so I do right by this group? When do I need to stop my first round comments? 10, 7 minutes? Just so I do right here.
In 12 minutes, you're fine.
Okay, cool. Thank you. First of all, we all know that our healthcare workforce and first responder workforce is exhausted. Words like burnout are often used. Empathy fatigue is another word that's used because our empathy is we lean in and with so much. How do we create healthy boundaries? And really, it's about how do we do our jobs? I mean, one of the hardest parts of this whole thing isn't people giving up. It's caregivers. How do I do that caregiving thing that I'm called to do as a healer? And that is immensely challenging. So we are deep right now in how we build the skills of active listening and motivational interviewing and changing systems so that we can care for our 120,000 caregivers more. Because right now, that caregiver workforce is really challenged after 2 years of all of this. And now with COVID, blessed be, finally reducing and people needing to get the care they've deferred for 2 years, we got a real issue of how our caregiver, and it's not just Providence, it's the whole country and your communities too, and other providers that I know are on this call, how do we make sure our workforce is really ready to meet these needs right now of so much deferred care and suffering that has not been met over the time. So that's the first curve of this workforce issue. The second is, what is the workforce of the future? And I want to really challenge us to be thinking as you're looking at your beautiful design in this broad mission statement, is it's not just how do we get more psychologists, psychiatrists, and the docs and but what does the workforce of the future look like when less of it is inside the delivery system and more of it is in our schools and workplaces and places of worship and senior centers and then you start to say, oh, community clinic integrated care, where some things are happening from providers and like some of the professionals and organizations on this phone, but more is happening out in the community. What is that workforce? Because it doesn't just look like people who plug in to the big providers. So that's the second curve. Care for the people we have now, and how do we look at that workforce of the future and build the pipelines, particularly of our Black, Brown, Indigenous, immigrant, LGBTQ communities, and others who often are particularly needed because they are the bridge to folks who often feel excluded in our care delivery systems. So more of an integration and welcoming of people with lived experience and who reflect the diversity of our community is exactly who we needed on the front line of our workforce, because then we know that care is not only about affordability, but it's, do I feel safe? Do I feel welcome? Am I okay here? Can I get that done? So I think there's a real opportunity to be thinking about that workforce of the future in the context of the integrated delivery system of the future, not just how are we going to get a few more people to fill slots. And then the third is how do we distribute care out in the community, which is my main point, which I'll come to in a minute. So care for the people we have now, think about and build the pipelines for the workforce of the future, and how do we distribute those skills broadly so that all of us have these skills. We all become our own first responder for and with each other. That starts to sound like community. We show up for each other. That's what we do, right? That's what we all do. Red, blue, didn't matter less. That's what we do. We show up for each other as human beings. So ever so briefly, next slide. Wellbeing Trust, just so you know, was founded by Providence 5 years ago when it joined with St. Joe's Health System. Our board chair, Dr. Rod Hochman, leads this, and we have the full support of our sisters. And you can read all of this. And one of the reasons that I really care about them is that, they're handing over so much of their enterprise to lay leaders like myself, person of faith, but lay leader. And their admonition to us is really one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard or received. We can't tell you what to do because we don't know. But we ask that you take prudent risks for the poor and vulnerable by watching the signs of the times. That's how they roll. So that's how we're looking. What are the signs of the times? What are we learning? What's needed? And how are we prioritizing those who are most vulnerable? Because that's our ministry, if you will. Even if we're somewhat secular, that's our mission, therefore, led by those sisters. And they said, build a movement. Well, okay, not build a movement because there's a lot underway across the country, not going to be arrogant, but let's grow it, right? And what does that mean? So I'll get into this. I'm going to say it right now because you may find later for your regional community, multi-county community that you're thinking of, that you're working with here, are these 7 movement nodes in place? Because what we then did was we reverse engineered social movement practice and looked at everything from suffrage 100 years ago to civil rights, to the war movement, to the environmental movement, to marriage equality, and whatever you think about those movements isn't the point. It's what caused them to be successful or not. And we found 7 elements: strong, clear vision and leadership, data, which I know is a key value of yours, policy mechanisms that allow you to shift policy to pay for or enable, remove barriers, whatever, pathways for community people to create distributed leadership, right? We can do collective leadership, but distributed leadership, as we were talking about the civil rights movement. You didn't have to march with Dr. King to want to stand for civil rights. That's a distributed action. And I can do that any day when I find exclusion or othering occurring. So distributed leadership is the key. I love that that's a frame of what you're doing overall. We need to bring more money into the field. So we started mindful philanthropy. We needed to sharpen policies. So we built Inseparable. We built a partnership with Kaiser Family Foundation on data because we needed more granularity than what we were seeing. It was all rear view mirror data. So I can go into that, but we identified 7 nodes that were key to an effective movement nationally and regionally. And you might want to think a little bit about how are we doing on leadership, data, policy, communications alignment and measurement, pathways for people to get engaged, these kind of aspects of local movements that enable distributed action. Okay, anyway, that's what the sisters charged us with and putting resources out. Next slide, if you could, please. Having had the chance to work in literally 500 communities over the last 4 decades, and I'm sorry, this is not an animated slide. What it typically does is go from 1999 to 09 to, and it shows decade by decade. You don't need to know the data. You already know the trends. It's not going well. Next slide. And we also know that basically, and I don't mean to take offense because we're certainly not producing serious mental illness, or our society is probably not driving higher rates of first episode psychosis. We could probably have a debate around that, because serious mental illness has always been with us, and it always will. And we need to care particularly for those who struggle and their families and their caregivers who struggle with serious mental illness. But we are producing mental health illness as a society. We are a net producer. I can talk with you. Yeah. And so we need to be recognizing that our entire society, and I'm not get lost in adverse child events or adverse community experience here, but if you look at what's happening, othering, racism, exclusion, lack of economic opportunity, lack of educational outcomes, climate anxiety, we are essentially producing lack of well-being. And the methods that most of us are using to deal with our suffering is increasing our mental health and addiction challenges. So we can get, that actually then starts to say, well, part of our problem is that our human solutions to our suffering are driving public health challenges. And until we actually create enough safety to people to talk about what they're facing, get the care they need, and be respected with dignity for who and how we are, we're just going to keep producing more demand. And while I love your mission thing, we're just going to need more care for more people in a system that can hardly bear it in the first place unless we actually look at upstream. Okay, next slide, and I'm going to just chunk through this. So if you have multifaceted causality, individual factors like individual home, family traumas, etc., systemic elements, social and community conditions that are essentially making it difficult. What does it mean when you have a country where Black net worth is 0 in the United States on average? How do you possibly, build a society where everyone does well, right? It's resulting in deaths by alcohol, opioids, and suicide. And so therefore, we decided to take a systemic approach. Next slide. So everything we do fits in 3 buckets. And I'll blow through this pretty quickly and then hit our multi-solver and open it up. Community, care, and coverage. First piece, so everything we do sort of fits in this. First piece, care. Next slide. We need ecosystems, which you are in fact building, right? That have care delivery, but schools and faith and providers and data systems and increasing use of telehealth and other resources that together make sure that we increasingly meet the need in a clinical communicated way. I'm particularly interested in the work of Be Well Orange County. Check them out. Be Well Orange County, the little logo up there in the upper left-hand corner, who has built a crisis stabilization unit, 23.5-hour unit, but it is essentially a no wrong door access to any social needs in the community with warm handoff. So there's a place to go, law enforcement or their families or others to take someone, tied to warm handoff referral to food insecurity, housing insecurity, legal financial trouble, whatever that might be, including access to clinician. All right, next. And as we think about 988, which we know is rolling out as an alternative to 911, if you're not familiar with that, we'll talk about it more. You really have to think about what is that broader continuum of care out in the larger community that would help you respond. Okay, so the first part is care. And I think this is relevant for your community is we got to get the care right. Integrated, whole person care, no wrong door, with the assessment and referral of social needs, economic needs, as a standard of quality. Get the care right. Secondly, get it paid for. Next slide. That's the coverage part of our 3 buckets: care, coverage, and community. One of the things we've been doing is I've been partnering with the CEO of NAMI nationally, Dan Gillison, and the heads of the APAs, Psychological Association, Psychiatric Association, Mental Health America, National Council on Behavioral Wellbeing, et cetera, leading mental health and wellbeing kind of professional organizations, guilds, philanthropy, to identify what our policy priorities we could all agree to, because that's a group of folks who don't always agree and in fact have demonstrated fragmentation as a way of working together, not working together, that has really set back the country. That's not pointing a finger. We all recognize we just haven't been aligned. And when you're not aligned, you create fragmented solutions, which don't work, right? So we are saying these are 7 principles, and if you go to the next, that they need to be in place from early identification and prevention, et cetera, all the way to crisis care. We use that in California to pass SB 855 that increased mental health and addiction care for 13 million Californians. We turn around with Governor Pritzker a couple months later, did the same thing in Illinois. And there are other states, Georgia and that are happening where state law can in fact do that. And I think there's more we can discuss there. So get the care right and get it paid for. Next slide. And with the work we're doing around SB 1902 federal, we're also working with Inseparable, one of the organizations we started in the last few years, to really make sure that every young person has access to a professional. Now, out here in conservative country, this isn't about supplanting the role of the family, period. But it is about making sure that every young person has access to mental health and whole person care when they need it. And therefore, there's some really thoughtful framing about what do we mean by social emotional learning, et cetera. And so we think this is a key piece of property. And then finally, we've got to get the care right and got to get it paid for, including policies that the question is, let's go back to where Monty had us a few minutes ago. How do you create communities as gardens to grow people in? Oh, I see. I can maybe, yeah, there you go. Monty already went through this slide. Civic belonging and muscle. What does it look like to invest in the conditions that would reduce the prevalence of mental health and addiction challenges or health challenges in the first place, because you've done the work up front, which we all know we need to. And that's part of what your brilliance is how do you do that work so that your savings can be plowed right back into the front end to drive prevention. And with this is our major multi-solver. I'll put this on the table and then stop, because when we partnered with Monty and so many others in Thriving Together with the CDC Foundation, we went back to this workforce piece. We need more professionals, check. We need to create pathways to those roles, absolutely. But we are not going to professionalize ourselves out of the ills that we face. And so we are working right now in communities across the country, beginning to work in communities around the country, to spread basic skills of how to show up for another person. So that people can do that in their job at the Y, in their job or voluntary role in a faith community setting, in a daycare center, in a barber shop or a hair salon, housing development or project, where you look at that curve. We need our specialists. I mean, you look at the triangle. We need the specialists at the top. We need our professionals. We need down to the second to the bottom blue. Of course, we need more community health workers and navigators and qualified mental health advocates and peer support specialists and others. But the only way we're really going to get upstream is when we can turn to one another with safety and confidence and dignity, and know that each other are better trained to show up for each other because we have basic skills of healing presence, motivational interviewing, and light referral to make sure that we are our own first responder. And we think there's living wage jobs in that, empowerment for people who've been excluded, lived experience that wants to be brought to bear, and untapped resources in communities that are full of gifts and assets that are a way to help transform what's driving our well-being in the first place as whole people. I'm going to stop right there. Thank you for letting me share a bit. And I think our plan is to move into dialogue.
Yeah, perfect, Tyler. That really nice framing, I hope. And this is a new format for us, by the way. And so appreciate Penny and others kind of chiming in. I'm going to have a couple of questions for you, Tyler, before we segue out, but I just want to also let folks know if there are things that are coming to mind. I'm following the chat too. Penny, do you want to ask a question to Tyler?
No, I just have a lot of comments. Those of you on this call might be interested that many of us are in opposition to Health Bill 1865. And I think that that's what, Tyler was saying, get involved. Health Bill 1865, the HCA is adding hours upon hours of constraint on those of us with lived experience. And that's going to eliminate what he's saying, those that are in the community that can help. I had shared an experience that I had with somebody in the community that I just saw had had this horrible experience, and I saw it on Facebook. So I had reached out to her, and before we knew it, in a couple hours, you know, she had insurance and, well, the opportunity for insurance, and it had it set up in mental health and domestic violence, you know, assistance and stuff. And it doesn't stop there. For the next 2 weeks, I've been going back and touching base with her. Did you get this done? Did you get this done? It's taken 2 weeks till today is the day that she has her appointment with the domestic violence, you know, clinic. And because it takes time, she was in trauma, and I understand that. And I've supported her through that. And when you say a sense of community, it isn't a one-time touch, it's multiple touches. And that sense of who was going to help her. Was it going to be the police department? Was it going to be the doctor she didn't have because her children had insurance and she did not in the divorce? Who was going to make that contact? With our own personal story, for years, I reached out to the community. I reached out to my church. I reached out to the school. I reached out to other organizations that my son was involved in. And of no offense to those that are on this call in my community failed us. I don't think that we ever would have needed the highest care that the state had that point of contact worked for us. But because that point of contact didn't work, our crisis continued. My child had a mother that was dealing with diseases that we suspected to be terminal, multiple surgeries, feeding tubes, other siblings that had issues, very, you know, no child support coming in, very low income, an absentee father who was abusive and had taken an attempt on my life. I mean, there were so many ACEs factors going on in our home that it did play a part. And that's where that community support comes in. I truly believe that, you know, my son has a mental health issue and it escalated with an SUD issue. Those things I can never take away, but it was perpetuated by not having that community basis. And that's what we're looking at, is catching it earlier, doing those wraparound services right here. And I've learned that it's not a one-point contact. And I've learned you have to take it to the person.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
just a girl on Facebook. It was just a story. But who was going to help her?
Yeah.
Who was
Yeah.
going to help me? Who was going to help my child? So we have to start looking at this differently. We need to start looking at the legislation. How many people on this call even know what Health Bill 1865 is? Are you aware of what it's funding and what it's going to do to our peer advocates and how that money is going to be spent? It's that involvement. So I really appreciate that everything that you've shown. You basically have like unscrambled my brain and been able to put it in a slide. And I love that. Earlier when Monte was talking and kind of answering my question, there was even another place to put it as an individual. If we have an individual that has lost their car, that affects their employment. That affects whether or not they can keep their rent going. That affects whether or not they can feed their family. All of it is a domino effect. You take one of those pie charts out, they lose their housing.
Yep. So
Anyway, you're
Penny,
speaking to me.
Thank you, Penny. And I'm also, Tyler, I know we just have a couple more minutes, but Penny, thanks for always just being so vulnerable and helping us connect the dots in real ways. Tyler, I don't know if you have any thoughts just again around both the challenge and opportunity as we look at this work holistically from a community setting. And, you know, I don't know if you want to extend some of your comments on that front around what's it really going to take to kind of move into multiple points of connection and really a different type of culture. Tyler, you still
I
there?
think after 2 years, we'd learn how to come off of mute. These Zooms. Okay. First of all, I'm still learning a lot about your community. And I just want to begin by acknowledging that the configuration of leadership, almost, sort of almost 100 partners across 5 counties and all the different roles is a really important piece of what, I'm not trying to label you, but I might think of as civic infrastructure. Monty and I use this language sometime. These are skills and processes and relationships and ways of bringing data forward and having civic discourse and setting priorities and building political will that has to be built and maintained. When we talk about roads and bridges and power lines, it has to be built, it has to be maintained. That's how we think about infrastructure. This civic infrastructure has the same thing. It's not valued always. And I know you've come up against that. Why is this configuration, what is it doing? We know that not only you're advancing good work, but you are bringing trust and social capital to the equation. Any place there's polarity, or we haven't really been heard, or the data is not in high quality, the discourse hasn't happened, no matter how brilliant the strategy might be for some forward payment and reimbursement and all the great stuff you're doing with Medicaid dollars and so forth. But if it's not rooted in trust, Monty, if I guess that's where I want to take the first part. If it's not rooted in belonging and civic muscle, that turns out to be the key enabling ingredient to getting many of your good strategies. And so I just want to acknowledge that you're on such a good path and keep going down that way. That doesn't mean endless process and hearing, but that is part of our democracy at some level. And it is into those trust relationships that your most brilliant ideas can advance. And at the risk of quoting the late Stephen Covey, change occurs at the speed of trust. And I think that there's just no getting past that quality in my response to you, Monty, because this country's full of brilliant ideas, and it just doesn't happen because of the leadership structures aren't built in a way that actually build that kind of confidence and trust across the community. And that's what I experience you doing. Monty, is there any place in particular in the last that you would like me to make something that we talked about, I just missed, or that
I think we're going to get a chance. You set us up really nicely to kind of hear about some local bright spots.
Yeah.
I want to get to that in just a minute. And maybe, Tyler, you've always been a person that's been pragmatic and hopeful. And this is a moment where I think people are struggling to, feel like there is hope. And you're in the middle of a lot of communities, a lot of opportunities. I just wonder if you wanted to take one last kind of run at
I'll tell you what gives me hope, like multi-solvers. And I don't know, Monty's going, you guys, maybe you'll invite me back. We'll have another conversation. When I was living in Oakland and at Kaiser Permanente, I was trying to get our physicians, Kaiser docs, to write food prescriptions. They wouldn't. Why? Because there's no pharmacy. They write the metformin prescription and they know it was fulfilled. They weren't going to write a food prescription. So we partnered up with Sutter and the UCSF and Cal Berkeley and the other anchor institutions to create a whole new food delivery system called My Cultivar. You're going to love this as a multi-solver, and I'll see if I can stick the dismount here in the next 90 seconds. We formed a cooperative, which means that there could be multiple owners, the owners of which were returning incarcerated. So we were going to bring people who were coming out of incarceration to be part of the food aggregation, distribution, delivery, catering, etc., for a new enterprise, right? We're incarcerated. Yes. The food was to be sourced within a couple 100 miles. So it was a local food initiative, drawing the Central Valley, connecting it to the Bay Area, etc., and creating green living wage jobs and some ownership. The mechanism allowed the sourcing of food and the aggregation and distribution to be patient meals back in the delivery system, to go into the food carts and catering, and to be able to be delivered for people that had a hip and knee replacement or kind of needed a more robust Meals on Wheels delivery, et cetera. So that we fulfilled food prescriptions. We created a back-end delivery system. We created green living wage jobs for people that were unlikely to get one, bought regional fresh foods that were, and then we started saying, what is this project? Is it a health project, a job project, a food project, a civic project, a rural urban project, a neighborhood revitalization, gardens, not just nice little farmers market here and garden there, but actually an integrated food delivery. So what is this thing? It was all of them. That's what a multi-solver looks like when you really find it. And because it's good for a lot. And I think the more we can find things that are pragmatic like that have a venture in them, that solve problems and work for us mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically as whole people, and reclaim those who are lost, just like we're reclaiming clean food, and turn it into a delivery mechanism. That's what excites me. And I see that kind of thing happening. And it only happens regionally. You can't make that happen in Washington State or Washington, D.C. That happens when regions come together. So
That's great, Tyler. I mean, it's the flip of what Penny and others were saying. I mean, you take one of the vital conditions and there's compounding challenges, and a good solution can solve multiple problems. So what is the compounding multi-solving opportunities here within mental health, around workforce, around housing? And yeah, I really appreciate your kind of reminding, our friends in North Central that what they're building in distributed leadership really is a movement. They have a lot of pieces already in place. And I think that how do we start to rethink of our role as all of us as healing, in healing and caring? And so, I'd love to just, thank you, Tyler, for being here with us, and hopefully a resource on ongoing journey, and maybe just turn to, for a moment, our panel. So,
and as you do, I'm going to sign off. I love that we named Paul Farmer. Paul Farmer, who passed, always knew that the solution was in communities. You think you got resource problems? Look where he worked.
Yep.
Blessings to each of you.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Take care.
Thank you, Tyler.
Blessings.
Great. Well, we are ready. I'm going to just invite in a local panel of the bright spots, and kind of breathe some life into kind of what is this starting to look like, and what we have to build on locally. So Anna Gonzalez, who's with Chelan County Behavioral Health, as one of the unit division program managers. And I don't know if Paul Hadley is here, but I believe that Duane Duncan is here from the Center for Alcohol and Drug Treatment. And then Wendy Brzezny, who is with North Central ACH and is Director of Clinical Integration. So welcome to all of you. And so have just a couple of round of questions. And again, same thing, welcome any comments or suggestions, and then we're going to pivot into some breakouts. But maybe to start with, going to ask Anna, if you're here, if you would just kind of do a brief introduction of who you are, your role.
Anna's actually not here, just so you know. It looks like she hasn't been able to join us. So in the spirit of being nimble and flexible, I say let's go forward with Duane and Wendy, and also encourage any one of our participants here today to chime in and unmute and be part of our panel in the moment. So let's just do that. Does that sound good, Monty?
That sounds more than good. So Duane, do you and Paul want to start?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Duane Duncan. I work at the Center for Alcohol and Drug Treatment. And so, we're an alcohol and drug treatment center, and that's what we do. And we also kind of, work with mental health as well, because we like to refer, during our intake process, we can kind of hear if a patient's having some of those issues, or if they're maybe taking drugs to counteract a mental health issue. So that kind of, makes sense to us. And then when this whole thing came around, like, integrated care and things like that, we didn't know what that looked like for us. And we're an alcohol center. What do we do with that? And how can we do that? And so one of those things we kind of grabbed onto was, well, we can do diabetes screening, because diabetes is a social determinant of health. It's out there. I mean, it's nationwide, worldwide. So we're like, we can do that. What's that look like? And so in talking about that, we were looking at like, okay, how can we incorporate this, and what's the best way to do this to see if the system we come up with is going to work? So our initial test project has been with our intensive inpatient and our intensive outpatient, because we see them the most. And so part of that process was, what data do we really need? what data do we need and how are we going to do referrals? And so we kind of came up with like, okay, we want to know the date that we did the diabetes screen. We want to know the referral, like, did we refer them out or are they already under doctor's care? And then, what department did we do this in? And so that was kind of like the first things we started with. And we found out that after a short time of running some results, running some data results, and we were not getting what we needed. So we kind of went back to the drawing board of our data collection piece and to see like, what was working, what wasn't working. We found out pretty much none of it was working. So I talked to the people that were involved. Those were those two people that were collecting that data, and I asked them, how did your interview process go with the patient? And what information could you glean from that brief interaction, and how can we put that into tangible data? So at the meeting with them, we kind of determined like, okay, we want the date, we want the department, we want to know the score, and we want a section that we can write referral. But we don't want this in an Excel sheet because then that's not accessible to everyone. So we currently have an EHR, and I was able to go in and build that information into our EHR. So now on our client profile, anybody can go in there and you can see when we did their diabetes screen, what department we did it in, what their score was, and did we do a referral or did the patient, refuse that? And not only do we have that, we also have a history. So if a patient was here a year ago, we can go back in and see a history. Oh yeah, we did a diabetes screen a year ago and you were at a 2. We noticed this year you're at a 7. And then that can lead to further dialogue with their counselor and stuff, because that's where they would get referred back to. Now I can track that data on a consistent level all the time. And that was really important to us. And now the next thing for this whole process is, how do we get counselors? How do we get staff on board with, why just screening diabetes to start off with is an important thing. So we had some staff who were able to share their stories. And basically what they had shared during their process is, if it had not been for another staff member to recognize that they had a problem, they would have not got the help. And that's what really brought this together is, if we could recognize this now, we can get them connected to a doctor. Someone may not even be aware that they may be even pre-diabetes. They're not sure of this stuff. And so now with what we have and the buy-in by the staff, and I'm not talking just counselors, our front office staff are involved, our inpatient staff are involved, and even our outpatient counselors. So now that we're all involved in this process, and again, this is just one thing of diabetes, we thought that doesn't matter. I mean, how does that even impact us? Well, we are seeing that now because we are getting our patients connected with doctors. And the goal of that is, if we get them connected with a doctor, then they're going to start getting the care they need. They're starting to maybe change their food, and then they're going to start feeling healthier. And so that's kind of where this really went from one little thing we thought was nothing to how now we actually be helping even save lives on that physical side as well. So for us, it was, and now the next step for us is, now that we're still refining a little bit of our processes, the next step is, how do we roll this out to every one of our patients who walks through the door? So that's kind of where it was exciting to go from one spectrum of not seeing any importance to now we see it's just as important as checking for mental health as well now. So that's kind of what we have. Exciting times though, for sure.
Yeah, well, that's a brilliant, tangible example. And again, Duane, is Paul with us? Is there any part of the story? Was he able to join, or just you right now?
It looks like it's just me for right now.
Well, I'm not to say just you. I'm really delighted to have you. I just want to make sure I didn't exclude anybody. And a really, again, beautiful example of something that's fragmented, not thinking of it as a system, a small change that has these ripple impacts in, all the small pieces that you all put in place, and knowing that what I'm hearing in your story, the first thing that you tried didn't work right away and you kept at it. Would love to kind of loop back with you, but Wendy or others, welcome you to kind of jump in a little bit around kind of what you're seeing or doing in the space that you're working in.
Thank you. I just wanted to say I appreciate Tyler's conversation that he had with us. I resonated with a lot of things he said, and thinking of this behavioral health stakeholder work group that we have convening, many of you are familiar with it, is really aligning with what Tyler said and bringing about looking at the system and what are we and who are we as a system doing to change it so that we can increase the well-being of others, and how can we improve it? And that's exactly what we're doing. So if you're not familiar with it, we've met a couple of times. We have an in-person meeting coming up and in March, and we can drop that link in the chat. If you're interested, you can register for that. But we have 10 meetings total to really look at the system, and it's just the start of really looking at what can we do, how can we come together to develop a system to allow those that are around us. And we've asked individuals who work in the system, we've asked those with lived experience or anyone who really has an interest in behavioral health to come together so that we can recreate the system in our region so that those around us can thrive. And so I really appreciate what he said. It's very energizing and exciting, and makes us realize that we are on the right track as a group that is convening and looking at the right things.
Yeah. Thank you, Wendy. And to Caroline's point earlier on, I don't know a lot of the folks on the call, and just if there are other either comments or questions or something that you're working on that is a multi-solver or related to mental health in particular, would love to hear in the chat, or please come off mute.
And Monty, by multi-solver, I've heard you say this word many times, so it means something to you, but I'm still, can I just explain what I think it means to make sure? Because I'm not sure if other people are wondering what that term means. I'm guessing it's just that if problems are interconnected, we're implementing solutions that are hitting multiple things, right? Not just looking at one area, like acknowledging the interdependence. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly.
Thinking outside of our boxes.
Yeah. I mean, I think that what Duane presented is a great example of a multi-solver, this screening and kind of the impact that has had in his team. And Duane, I don't want to put, I'm just trying to get my head around all that you're doing, but you're adding something that was an incremental improvement. It wasn't a heavy lift, but it is improving the lives of those that you're serving that are wrestling with alcohol or drug barriers in their lives. But being physically healthy is just going to add to that. So this multi-solver of those that are trying to care for those other parts have these ripple effects. And Tyler kind of alluded to it. We see it a lot of it like in mental health or in food, again, creating more food jobs and more dignified work environments, accrue benefits to people's mental health, and really doing it in a way that supports transportation so they have closer, more affordable access. So one solution can solve multiple challenges or opportunities with vital conditions. And so that's you put it exactly right. I'm kind of curious from anybody, Caroline, you're on there now, and Wendy, as you're thinking about the stakeholder engagement process and what would be the signs that you would be seeing as we're moving towards whole person, whole health? I mean, these are big notions and everybody thriving. What would be the big signals that we'd like to see in our region that would tell us, or Duane, back to you, that we're really making progress towards whole person, whole community health? What would you like to be seen?
So for us, I think something that would be, I think some of the things that we still struggle with is that connection with the doctor. Like, we can do the referral, but it'd be nice to have that connection with the doctor, because then the doctor can relay back, hey, by the way, this person came in. Yes, they do have diabetes. And because then we can incorporate that part of our treatment plan with them. Not only is the doctor a point of contact, but now we can be that point of contact as well. Hey, I noticed you're a little sleepy today, and maybe that's because their blood sugar level is low. And also be beneficial for our staff, because, as an agency, maybe we need to have some stuff on standby. Now, we do have a kitchen, so I will say we've had patients that have come in and their blood sugar levels have dropped, and we have test kits here. We can test that. Or if they're really high, we can test it and get them off to the ER or wherever else. The other thing too, with doing the diabetes screening, and having these conversations, our clinicians are a little more, they also pay attention to other things. We've had patients come in with sores, and they're asking them, hey, have you been to the doctor recently? What's kind of going on there? So not only is it now diabetes, but we're noticing other physical things going on with the patient, and that we can relay them. Maybe we need to personally take them up to the ER. I know myself, in the last 10 years, I've had to rush a couple of people to the ER because they were not in good shape for whatever reason. They either came in loaded. So our counselors are really starting to pay attention to other things. But I think the biggest thing for us is having that two-way street between us and the doctor. I think the doctor especially needs to know that, hey, this patient is, they are addicted to something. So maybe the doctor can look at some other prescriptions to give versus something that's going to just lean right into their addiction. And then that just, exacerbates the problem even more so. The other thing I was going to mention with Wendy is, with mental health and substance use, I still get this feeling that it's still looked down upon. And this is just my impression, that it's not made much progress from where it was, 5 years ago or even 10 years ago, that, people still want to keep that stuff hidden, that, that they have a mental health problem. And for me, I struggle with why are we not there as a society to accept that, yes, this is going on. And you're right. He was talking about, we're creating more mental health issues because of the outside world, food insecurities, things like that. I guess, how do we get to that point where maybe society can start accepting that? And then we build from there. I think accepting that, yes, this is going on. And even within our own agencies and just in here alone, sometimes when you have where's alcohol, drug, that's ours. That's what we want to know. And for us, that's not necessarily the case anymore. If we have patients come in and we know that we're not the best fit for them, we refer them out. Because for us now, it's that individual patient. Does it mean we lose some money? Absolutely. But are we putting the patient at the right location? That's the key part for us. Whether that's another inpatient facility, whether that's sending them to New Path at CVCH because maybe they need the doctor as well as the SUD. Maybe it's where we're working with Catholic Charities hand in hand. They work on the mental health stuff. We work on the SUD. I think that's where the more collaboration needs to really happen. Is we need to let our guard down, let our protective stuff around. Oh, we're going to be giving up money if we do that. I think we've got to understand that it's not just about money here. We're talking about lives. And I think that's what's really impacted me this last couple of years, is seeing those people come through the door. And I just talked to my front office staff this morning. Each person that walks through our door, that's a life that you're going to have an impact on right from the get-go. You may set their day. They could be having a really bad day, but you offering that help may give them that little glimmer. I've seen this huge in our PH29. We're really into the PH. We've been really monitoring our PH29. And I can't tell you how many times we do not let anybody walk out that door if they mark down that they have thoughts of suicide. They are always talking to somebody before they walk out that door. We want to make sure they're safe. And then we follow up 7 days later with them, whether they're a patient or not. And that's some of the things that I've really seen the center grow in, is that it's no longer about a money issue, it's a life issue. And we can, just as an SUD, we can impact so much just in our one facility alone to direct them to other places. And I never really looked at it that way until this last couple of years. Being part of this has really kind of pulled all that together.
Wow.
So anyways, sorry for rambling on there.
Mhm.
Not even. Please, Wendy.
Thanks, Duane. And from the stakeholder standpoint, I would say that just in the first couple meetings, we did a few exercises. The first one was a what, so what, now what? And the what is, what are the bare bone neutral observable facts about the behavioral health system? So we kind of listed that out. We broke into small groups and was able to do this. And then we talked about the so what meaning have we made from those facts? What is going on in our region's behavioral health system? Now, those joining us from the table represent about 10 different sectors. So it's a wide verse and across the entire region. So it's very diversified lens that people are offering. And then finally, we went through the now what. What does better look like? What is the next right step? And how do we aspire to improve our work as a collective? And our facilitators did really good by taking all this information and doing some groupings And the groupings ended up being access and providers, network awareness and partnerships, peer navigators, nurse coordinators, open beds, and transportation. And then we kind of did some on these on different areas of questions that they posed. And access and providers came up to number 1 on most of them. And Monty, you asked, what do I see as a measure of success? It brings me back to what Tyler said in workforce. What does the workforce of the future look like when it's less is institutional and more of it is in the schools, workforce, churches, communities? So success for me in this, a driver is, as this work group looks forward, looks at our system, a success would show how we are looking at behavioral health in all the different regions, not just with our behavioral health providers, just not within the institutions, but how are we doing this? How are we providing this safety, this access point in different parts of our community, that we're not waiting till it's so bad that they're having to see the doctor or they're having to be in the behavioral health, but we have safe places that people can go in the schools, in the homes, in the families, in the community, in the churches. And we're offering those to start with prevention and to start with those first steps. So when I'm thinking of this from a system standpoint, that's what I start to see as some of the success that can come out of this work group that we're convening. One of them, I should say.
And Monty, Deb has had her hand up. Deb Miller, do you want to unmute Deb?
Thanks, Caroline. I was going to share, I think it's timely. Yesterday, I had a long lunch meeting with a colleague who is another nonprofit leader here in the Valley, who has a client who has needs beyond the agency's ability to help figure out. So Action Health Partners has been helping strategize with this person. I continue to see what feels like, and I'm not saying this to be rude, what feels like clinical dumps into community. I've had 2 calls in the recent year and a half from community partners who have had hospital long length of stay discharged out into community to agencies that can house them, but that's about all they can do is house them. They don't have the skills and the staff to do the complex care management that really needs to be done. And most of the folks on this call know that Deb squeaks and whines a lot. And so I am working on how do we collect these stories in a succinct way. And I'm using actually, and I think Brooklyn's still on the call, I'm actually using a template from another partner nonprofit that is the success story template. So yesterday, this partner and I had a conversation about how do we collect the details of these stories in a succinct way that helps us start identifying root causes or common challenges, right? And so there are 6 columns on this spreadsheet. 1, what is the situation at hand? What is the demographic or the social determinant barriers for the individual? What are the measurables that could be measured if we had tools to measure it? What are the overarching challenges? Who were the partners involved in overcoming these barriers for the client? What were the actions taken and what is the successful outcome? So I'm going to give just a really quick, short, succinct. This is a story from Health Home, a client story. 51-year-old male or 53-year-old male on Medicaid, Health Home eligible, meaning he's a high complex health needs. Medical diagnosis include traumatic brain injury, seizure disorder, substance use disorder, failed corneal transplant ×2, esophageal stricture, and oral health disease. His social determinant factors were he lives in a recovery house because he couldn't afford housing. He's unemployed. He doesn't have transportation. He doesn't have a driver's license. The goal of the care coordinator, when the care coordinator engaged with this person, the goal is to identify short and long-term goals that are client-centered. The short-term goal that the client selected was fix his oral health issues. The long-term goal was employment. To me, medical utilization, employment, transportation are metrics that could be measured to show the collective impact on the community. The challenges that were faced is in this area where this client lives, there's very few oral health providers that will take adult Medicaid folks. So finding a dentist that would take the client's insurance. And in the midst of all of this, the client had an emergency bowel obstruction surgery that he had to recover from. I don't have the list of partners from this narrative, but my sense is what I read in the story was the client was taught how to eat healthy, taught how to cook healthy, taught about strict diet compliance, weight management, was sent to an employment skills training so he could get skills. So the successful outcome is over the course of a short term, about, I don't know if it was a year or 2 years with this care coordinator, the client got his license back, the client purchased a car, the client improved their confidence and self-management skills to the point that they were rehired by their former employer. Then the client made a goal to improve his job, and he got another job with higher expectations and higher pay. He improved his lifestyle choices by eating and cooking healthy. The projection is this client will graduate from this program, which doesn't happen often with these clients just because of the case. But this client may say, I'm done, thank you, and graduate from the program. There was a comment sent to the care coordinator from the client. It says, I want to thank you for calling me at a time of my life when I really needed it, for being there to call and check in on me at a time in my life when I was very vulnerable and really scared and fragile. It has been a big help to me, and I really appreciate it. So this is the best kept secret of Health Home, right? We don't share these stories enough, but they can get long and detailed. So how do we start collecting them in short, succinct manner, and then start looking at the data? Where were the barriers? Where can we fix the issues? So thanks for your patience. Thanks for listening.
Oh my goodness, Deb, that was so poignant. I mean, the example that you bring, and just as Duane was suggesting, this is about lives. How do we bring in the story of what is and what's possible? It's really, really powerful. And I hear your ask to the group, which, can continue to go out beyond this call, is how do we use story and narrative to drive change and remind us of what's possible when we think differently about the systems and our relationship between the systems and that humanity's at stake here. Caroline, I'm wondering if it'd be okay if we allow folks to maybe just spend a little bit of time in breakouts. They've been hearing a lot of ideas. Maybe we could pivot there and then see what else might come up on the other side. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that makes sense given the time.
Yeah. So maybe just 15 minutes, we wanted to throw this back to you all. And these are just some guiding questions. Don't feel like you have to be locked into it, but just as I think we're starting to hear, what does whole person, whole health and thriving, mean or look like to you in our region? What might be some of those signals? Invite you to kind of answer that for you in the way that we just heard some of other local leaders. And what does it maybe look like for your organization or already happening and if you want to talk about how to bridge the upstream and downstream work. Welcome back. We're starting to kind of press towards a little bit of a close, but just wanted to offer some space. We're not going to do formal reports out, but have just a few minutes to see, what was bubbling up for you that felt like it was significant in your small groups, a theme or an idea where your group might have had energy. So just would love for people to take a minute to maybe come off mute. You can add in the chat, but maybe some folks could give voice to one thing that came out of your small group.
Hey, Rosalinda Kitty, I want to report out for Group 5, even though we're not doing formal reports. I'm excited. Our conversation was excellent, and thank you, Connie and Nancy, that were in the group with me. Something that the speaker said resonated with us, that had to do with how we are unconsciously producers and creators of mental health issues. And wow, from there, we just went to so many places about how, number one, it's great to hear how we have all been working together to identify, and we believe we're in the early stages of, actually identifying needs and helping people, whether it's through EHR and stuff like that, that Duane was talking about, and things like that. I mean, we in healthcare have been screening people for a while and trying to connect them to resources as well. But we spoke about going beyond and just investing in the typical services that we've been traditionally provided. How are we going to get there, and what are we going to do? We identify with the need for connection, relationships, and partnerships. And how do we start creating joint accountability in our communities to have this, who's going to start being responsible for what as we start building this within our own communities. Nancy's input from the Head Start perspective of our very smallest children out there was amazing, and how she spoke of the teachers who are leaving being teachers because they see the need and they know they can't do it as a teacher, but if they go to a different setting, which she spoke about is communities and schools, where they could make a difference. It was amazing. So we see where we can start putting some structure behind this in our communities. We know we have people who see the needs and want to help. And so from that, we need to start a movement, NCACH. Nancy had a great suggestion of how, if you start getting the momentum going and things like that, get people on board, it's amazing what you can do with the movement in your areas. Me as a CEO of a hospital, I look at, if I'm going to create a position to do this work for us, then I need to be very flexible as to what that position is going to do for us, because it's going to be changing and evolving as we go. And Connie, saying of how each of us in our own small spaces in this work, which is huge, we can start speaking about this to one another and talking to our daily contacts, and really start asking for help. And that's how you start the conversation. So we had a great conversation. Thank you very much for this time today.
Oh, Rosalind, it sounds like an amazing conversation. That was 15 minutes. There's so many nuggets. That's brilliant. Thank you. Others, I see Kaylee in the chat. Thank you for that around the interoperability and a platform, that infrastructure being so key. What other things might folks speak into?
I can go. Our group spoke a lot about community engagement and really getting the voice of our community members. That's one way to help them thrive and kind of get out of the struggling, and also looking for opportunities for the multi-solver. That really stuck out to me, especially in the tri work and all the different opportunities moving forward as a coalition. So those were some of the main things that we highlighted in our conversations.
Thank you, Kelsey.
So something that really stuck out for me, and this is actually something what Kaylee said, is we're kind of like it's like a stool. You have the three legs. You have physical health, you have mental health and SUD, and then you have community support. And that's, and each one of those are still kind of silent. And that's where the interoperability comes in. We need to find a way to get together where all of those can be communicating on some level. But that I really liked the way she laid that out, because that's a nice little way to look at it. If you take one of those legs out, the patient's going to fall over. It's anywhere along the way, any one of those, you take it out, community support falls out, patient's going to fall over. And so I'd really like to see where we can go, because we've talked about this for a couple of years, How do we get our agencies be able to communicate better? And I think that's still something that needs to be looked at. I think really what it's going to come down to, we talked about it there, is the financial cost of that. I think, and maybe that's what's holding all this up, is that is not a small ask. That is a big ask, and then you have HIPAA and everything else. But there's enough smart people in this world. There's enough smart people here. Like, how can we get around that? To me, that's just an obstacle, and we got to find a way to get around that. So then we really truly can have whole person care on one level.
Thanks, Duane. Time for a couple more if folks would be willing or interested in speaking into things that popped up for their group. I can't see all of you, so I want to make sure I'm giving space and time there. One thing I'll just say that I'm hearing in these threads, a number of both ends, that we need the systems, we need the infrastructure. Some of it's the technology, some of it's mapping out the fragmentation of these systems. And it's also around changing our mindsets. It's, talking about a movement, a change in how we are seeing our communities, how we're seeing each other, how we're seeing our roles in that, and I see a lot of systems change work and some of the other work that we do that can be a little bit sterile. It's about changing the system. It's about tactics and measures. And what I'm hearing from a number of you is, yeah, we need those tactics, we need those strategies, but we also really need this highly relational way. And that includes how we're seeing people that are experiencing adversity, that are community members, that's not who they are. That doesn't define all of them. And it's how we engage people with lived experience have not been included that are closest to the solutions. And you all are on a really interesting pathway, I think, to really make this transition to something bigger and what you started expressing in your mission. And Caroline or John, I mean, maybe just, as our last couple of minutes here, boomerang it back to you all and see how you might want to kind of close this down for today.
I'll catch the boomerang and then I'll pass it to John. I think in our little breakout, actually, I was in the breakout with Molly and Dina. And what was great is we talked about some of the questions, but also they just spent time telling one another about each other's programs and how they might cross-refer to one another. And it just struck me that, this, what we're all talking about right now, speaking to one another and communicating, it takes time. And sometimes we have to just slow down to invest in those relationships. And it doesn't always feel like it's going to get you where you need to go when you're, juggling crises. But I think it's super important. And if you have thoughts about how you want the NCACH to continue to help be that matchmaker, as we were talking about in our group, then we're happy to do that. A few things that I'm still gonna need to digest that Tyler said is that I appreciate that fragmented solutions don't work when the problems are interconnected. I think we all know that. But I really love that he said that this is about being pragmatic and adventurous. I love that he said adventurous, because we need to take risks. We need to do things in a different way. And I think it's also kind of a hopeful message that spirit of being pragmatic and adventurous can only happen regionally. That stuck out to me too. Like, it doesn't matter what the feds or the state does to implement, a platform like Kaylee. I'm thinking of IT systems, even. What matters is what we do about it here regionally and how we come together around those shared challenges. So I guess the last thing too, I'm just looking at all the little thumbnails and then all the other people that aren't here today, but just that this idea that Tyler said, that there's untapped resources in our communities everywhere. Like, our communities are full of gifts and assets, including super rural communities. And we just need to remember that and figure out how to build that capacity and support them. So those are just some things that I'm taking away today and I will go digest some of it. Monty, I'm assuming we'll have the slide deck too to share with everybody. So the beautiful thing about you registering is now we know who attended, we have your emails, and we can follow up with the slide decks and other resources. So John, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, there's, in this whole thread of today, there are two things that kind of stood up to me that really came back, and this might also be a challenge that I'm putting out to the group as a whole today as well. And I'll say the first one came when Tyler was talking about distributed leadership, and he made this statement that you didn't have to be a civil rights advocate by having to stand next to Martin Luther King Jr. You could be a civil rights advocate on your own. And I think, to me, a lot of times when I think of distributed leadership, I think of distributed decision-making and everyone coming together to agree on a shared agenda and a shared priority. But what that made me think about is we are all advocates of the same vision and the same mission. So it's not NCACH leading this, but it is all of us. I would challenge everyone to go back to their work to advocate the idea of thriving together and how you do your daily operations. Advocate that to other people who should be at this table and who we should continually be talking to ensure that they are also behind this mission. Because, as Rosalinda said, we want to create a movement, and not a handful of people can really make a movement, but it really needs to be everyone moving together and everyone driving this day in and day out. And sometimes we'll speak the same language, but as long as we have the same vision and we're all moving in the same direction, that's really what's important. And the idea of multi-solving is really the same kind of aspect as well, right? Like thinking outside of what's your profession, what is your career, but how are we thriving together? And thriving together, and every component of that thriving is all of our responsibilities. I won't be doing, as Duane said, I won't be doing diabetes management for someone, but I should be cognizant of how their physical health is also being impacted, and making sure that I help make those connections versus just saying, I'll take care of your mental health, you figure out the rest of your life. So we're really, we're responsible to drive this movement together, and we're responsible to look out for the residents together. And I think that active component is key to moving from that passive, just supporting and providing information, to really being an active member of this is what's important, because it's not really just NCACH doing this, but it's us as a region doing this together. And we will succeed if we do that. And I will pass it back to you, Monte, for any final closing thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, John and Caroline. I don't know, not much I can say after that. I just am really encouraged and inspired by, this partner's insight. And hopefully this is one of many places as we continue to create this space, maybe slow down, remind ourselves of the assets that we have, remind ourselves that we have agency together to actively kind of create a new future.